Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning on this cold January day to the Harmon Museum's Lunch and Learn. I'm John Zimkus. I am the Education Director and historian here and sometimes speaker. There's a lot of interesting things going on. You're very lucky today because a brand new exhibit from the DAR called American Revolution Experience Traveling Exhibit. Its first stop in Ohio is the Harmon Museum. It technically isn't official until Friday night, but it's up and ready for you to see. It has 3 interactive kiosks, and it has some 12 screens depicting different aspects of the American Revolution. We also have some artifacts from our collection dealing with the American Revolution. You are invited, as is the entire public, to come to the official opening, which will be Friday night at 6:30. It'll be free. There'll be hors d'oeuvres and that sort of thing. The exhibit is from the DAR, but members of the SAR, Sons of the American Revolution, will have their honor guard and things on display on Friday night, which you also might enjoy. And for the entire time it is up, from January 16th to February 16th, admission to the museum is free, and that is courtesy of Miami Valley Gaming. So there will be no charge if you want to come back and bring the family, or you have a group you want to see the exhibit, or anything else we have. There will be no admission from January 16th to February 16th. Some other things going on at the museum are arts collection, society, fashion industry classes. Our art and society classes will begin next Tuesday. They were going to begin yesterday, but we thought the weather was a little bit much to have. They always close school when it's too cold or delay school. Well, it's also for night classes. So for us, when many of the students are young at heart, but not necessarily set up for the cold weather. There will be 4 lectures. I will be giving one on industry, but there will also be others on art and society, fashion, and collections. The Harmon Arts will have a stained glass class on January 20th. This is for students 5 to 14. There's a $12 admission, 1:30 to 2:30 in the afternoon. It will coincide with what we're doing that particular Lunch and Learn, which is going to be on Tiffany glass. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The Music at the Museum is returning in February on the, I can't read my handwriting here, I believe it's the 8th. The McKeons will be here, a Scottish Celtic contemporary group, and that'll be on a Thursday night at 7. There'll be a small admission charge for that. The following month, we'll have Fintan, the Irish pub band, very popular Irish pub band, and they will be here on that's Thursday, the 14th of March at 7 o'clock. A very interesting thing, and a very thing we're proud of, the Harmon Museum's exhibit, the Gallery Armstrong of Flight, the Armstrong Gallery of Flight, which is on Neil Armstrong and also on early flying and what have you in Warren County, is now part of the Aviation Trail Incorporated through the Dayton area. It's really a feather in our cap. There are like 18 places on that trail, and of course the ones you would expect, the Armstrong Museum up in Wapakoneta, the the Wright Brothers Shop, the Dunbar House, Hoffman Prairie Flying Field, several others, of course, the Air Force Museum. And like I say, there's about 18 or 19, but now we are so proud to have been included in that list. And bring more people's attention to what we have here in Warren County. As far as lunch and learns go in the future, as I've already alluded to, the Tiffany Glass will be our February topic. Louis Comfort Tiffany, Painting in Glass, February 21st. What words come to mind when you hear the words Tiffany stained glass? Who was Louis Comfort Tiffany? How come his glass is so much different than all his competitors? How much did it take to create? A fascinating story about Tiffany and his creations. Our speaker will be Donna Summers. She got involved in this because she spends part of her winter in Jekyll Island down south, and they just recently redid a stained glass, Tiffany glass there. And she was mesmerized by the process and became fascinated. She's a good friend, an excellent friend of the Harmon Museum. She is the curator of the Armstrong Gallery of Flight. She's also the curator of our mid-century modern display. That's the room which has furniture which you and I grew up with in our family house. But she's the curator of that also. She's also a very fine author of postcard mysteries, which we do sell in the, although she used a pen name. Carol Tonneson, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. Tonneson, thank you. Come March 20th, our lunch and learn will be Easter decorations through the years. Linda Martin, our very good friend. I don't see Linda here, but I see her sister. But she in the past has done fantastic lunch and learns on Halloween decorations and Christmas decorations. And the amount she has is mind-boggling. But then after she had done the beautiful one on Christmas, she said, oh, by the way, I've got one on Easter. So it's fascinating. It's great stuff. Come April 17th, the Harmon Museum Historic Players, I gave a name to our group. We're going to talk about Charles Dickens visiting the United States for the first time in 1842. And in his visit, it included going through Lebanon and eating at what is now the Golden Lamb. That was 182 years ago. The lunch and learn will be on the 17th. He was in Lebanon on April 20th. And most of it will be his words, newspapers saying about him visiting at that time, and the recollection of his secretary, a man from Boston named George Washington Putnam, and what he recalls. So I could say it's going to be like 80% the words of the people who were involved in it, much of it Charles Dickens himself, what he thought he enjoyed and what he didn't care for. And he did look at things with a critical eye. I must confess, our May Lunch and Learn is blank right now, but I have a couple of feelers out there, and hopefully that won't be blank for much longer. The June Lunch and Learn, I'll have the privilege of being your speaker. It'll be the wit and wisdom of Tom Corwin, probably the greatest Warren Countyan to come out of our community here in the 19th century. Fantastic resume, governor, secretary of the Treasury of the United States, U.S. congressman, U.S. senator, prosecuting attorney, ambassador to Mexico, and one of Lincoln's original pallbearers. And often been compared to Lincoln in their upbringing. They have similar upbringing, but the 230th anniversary of his birth will be this summer, and later on in the year we will have a display on Tom Corwin artifacts. He was considered the greatest stump speaker in America, quite the humorist. Lincoln couldn't wait to tell the latest Tom Corwin story. Unfortunately, not as well known today as he was 100 years ago, but still a fascinating individual. In July, Suzanne Anderson Taylor will come back. You may recall a couple of years ago, she did a talk on letters from Paris, her grandmother's high school pen pal, and the years just prior to World War II. And her grandmother saved all those letters and what this young man, beginning at age 16, was saying about what's going on in France and when the Nazis are coming. Why doesn't the United States come sooner and help us, and that sort of thing. Fascinating. And then she also did one last year on the coronation, in England, when King Charles was crowned, and she talked about all the procedures and all the robes. She's going to be talking about another relative. This one happened to go off to California in 1849, part of the Great Gold Rush, and the letters he wrote back and what it was like for him and why he came back to Ohio eventually. So these are some of the lunch and learn things we have coming in the future. I hope you will join us at that time. By the way, the meal you are having today is once again done by Watkins. You're enjoying chicken spinach roulade. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's seared chicken stuffed with onion, spinach, and cheese, roasted sweet potatoes, and you're going to have buckwheat pancakes with macerated strawberries and whipped cream. Sounds pretty good. I'm looking at my plate right now. So enjoy the rest of your meal, and we will have our speaker in 10, 15, 20 minutes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the January Lunch and Learn for the Harmon Museum here in Lebanon. Before we go any further, I have to thank Joyce Lovings-Browning for her assistance in getting our speaker today. We could not, without her help, we would not have a speaker at all. She grew up in the Harrison, Okeana area, Southwest Ohio, has been doing performing living history for over 20 years now, retired as a naturalist coordinator of the great parks of Hamilton County, but now enjoys working part-time for the tour coordinators of Ohio Travel Treasures. Joyce has been involved in getting us some fantastic speakers over the years. She brought in Annie Oakley, the famous female sharpshooter. She brought in Mary Cunningham, the somewhat infamous Cincinnati body snatcher. Mary Draper Ingalls, the captive of the Shawnee in 1755. Lottie Moon, the Confederate spy who once lived in Oxford, Ohio. Martha Washington, our first lady, and of course, our first lady today, Julia Dent Grant. Julia Dent Grant was born in St. Louis. She grew up in a small plantation known as Whitehaven, and she ended up being in the White House with her husband. U.S. grant. There were some struggles, of course. Her family was somewhat pro-Confederate, and she married the man who would eventually epitomize the successful general for the Union forces. She did write her personal memoir, but could not find anyone to publish it in her lifetime, and it was finally published in 1975, 73 years after her death. On a very important point, in just 9 days, it will be her 198th birthday. So it is my great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, and honor to introduce to you First Lady Julia Dent Grant.
Why, thank you, John. And like he said, my name is Julia Dent Grant, but it's Julia Boggs Dent Grant. And of course, if my name doesn't mean anything to you, then I'm sure my husband's will. Some of you knew him as a general. All of you knew him as a president, U.S. Grant. So my husband has been the light of my life. And of course, not too many people know little old me. So let me enlighten you about Miss Julia. As the gentleman said, I was born in St. Louis. It's just a little west of St. Louis was our plantation of Whitehaven. My daddy was Colonel Frederick Dent, and my mama's name was Ellen. Now, Daddy never spent one single day in the military, but he dubbed himself a colonel because he felt he was in charge of everything around him. But we knew who exactly was really in charge, and that was my mama. Now, she came from a very influential family back east, and she was very well educated, and she believed that all of her children should be well educated too. Now, I was the oldest daughter, but I had 4 older brothers. I was the first girl born. So you can understand, while I was probably the apple of my parents' eye. My younger sisters, I had 3 younger sisters. There was 8 of us all together. One of them did not survive infancy, but my 2 younger sisters always said that what Miss Julia wanted, Miss Julia got. And they were pretty much right on that account. So growing up, like I said, I had 4 older brothers. They were very handsome and athletic. So at school, all the girls wanted to catch their eye. They knew how much my brothers cared for me, because sometimes when it was raining or nasty out, they'd carry me to school. They would make a nice swing with their hands and carry me in, because they knew how much I didn't like to get my shoes dirty. So sitting on those hard benches at school, I didn't like that either. So Mama made sure that I had a nice little embroidered chair that I could sit in. And so whenever there was dances or parties, the older girls in my class and my school, they would invite me because they knew my brothers had to escort me there. Oh yeah, I had a great childhood. I do believe that I grew up in privilege. And when I was older, I went to an all-girls school. Mama thought that I needed to go to a finishing school. So I went to a school in St. Louis, and that was when I was about 10 years old. Now, I wasn't a great student. I did not like mathematics. I had an eye condition where sometimes I could see 2 things at the same time, and it was always a strain on my eyes. So that was my excuse for not learning Roman numerals. I hated Roman numerals. I could never catch on to those things. V's and I's and X's didn't make any sense to me. But I did excel in music and art, and I loved to read. My eyes didn't bother me when I wanted to read something I wanted to read. But I do know that one time we would stay at the school during the week. Sometimes I'd go home on the weekend. But we were reading books on a Sunday afternoon, some of the girls in my class out on the lawn. And I was reading a book called The Dashing Lieutenant. And one of the other little gals, she got tired of reading her book and she wanted to play a game. She said, why don't we go around and name the husband we would like to have and what we would like him to be. And some of the girls were naming boys we knew, of course, and others were naming they wanted to marry a lawyer or a doctor. But you know, I was reading that book, The Dashing Lieutenant, so I swore I was going to marry me a military man. Little did I know I was predicting my own future. But that was when I was about 12 years old, so I finished my schooling. And when I was 18, I graduated, and it was about the same time that my brother Frederick was graduating from West Point. Now, he'd been writing me letters for quite some time about his roommate, a young gentleman by the name of Ulysses Grant. He said he was a wonderful man that had a heart of gold, and that I should meet him, and that we would get along quite well. And so my brother was being sent out west, but Ulysses was going to be sent to Jefferson Barracks. Now, Jefferson Barracks was only 5 miles from Whitehaven. So when he was first transferred out there, he visited my family like my brother asked him to do, and my 2 younger sisters met him. And they could talk of nothing else but the handsome young lieutenant that came to the house that was friends with Frederick. So when I came home from school, it wasn't long before he paid us a visit, and we became very attached to one another very quickly. My brother was right, we got along quite well. Now, Ulysses, he was a rather tall young man for me, but he's very slim, dark, thick hair, and bright blue eyes. He was very handsome. And I considered him dashing. Now, it was in early February, I believe. It was not long after my birthday that I came home, and I met him. And by May, he asked me to marry him. And I told him no. I liked the idea of being engaged, but I didn't really think I wanted to be married. But he was a persistent young man. You see, he was from Ohio, and he had been raised by his mother mainly in her values that he had. And when he was born, he was a rather large child, his mother said, but he was nearly a month old before they named him. They couldn't decide on a name until finally his family got together, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, they all got together and said, you got to name this baby. So they all decided to put 2 names into a hat. And the first 2 names drawn out would be his name. His grandmother was reading the Iliad by Homer. So you know where that name came from. But his grandfather was a minister, and he put in a biblical name of Hiram. Hiram was drawn out first. Ulysses was drawn out second. His name was Hiram Ulysses Grant at birth. His initials was H-U-G. He did not quite like that very much. And so he always went by Ulysses. Ulyss, or Lys, was his nickname. And he grew up, he had younger brothers and sisters, but he grew up as a quiet boy. He was educated there in Georgetown. His father, Jesse, owned a tannery. The tannery was across the street. And his mother's name was Hannah. And Ulysses just absolutely didn't like the tannery. Ulysses loved horses. His father always had a lot of horses. He also had a hauling business where he had big draft horses. And there was more than one time when a neighbor would run over and tell Mrs. Grant, "Your baby is walking underneath these draft horses." And her answer was, "Ulysses understands horses, horses understand him." But he loved to run his hands underneath the draft horses when he was a toddler. But by the age of 9, he was training horses for neighbors' farmers. He was so good at riding a horse that he could ride one bareback, standing up. And sometimes he'd get reprimanded for going a little too fast down the main road. But Ulysses had a knack with him. There was even one time he told me that there was a circus that came to town when he was a little bit older. And the circus had a pony that they claimed was unrideable. And anybody who could ride this pony would get a $5 prize. $5 was a lot of money, especially to a 12-year-old boy. So this horse was supposed to be extremely fast. Ulysses stepped up, said he could do it. He got on the horse. He stayed on the horse. He rode the horse as if he was part of the horse. So the trainer decided to throw a little monkey wrench in there. Actually, it was a real monkey. He had a monkey jump on Ulysses' back to distract him, but it didn't. So then he had the monkey get on his shoulders and pull his hair, and he still stayed on. So the trainer gave up and paid him $5. And Ulysses also, he drove a wagon, the hauling wagon for his father a lot of times. And he just didn't want to be around what his father was doing. He didn't like the tannery business. He actually did not like the sight of blood. He would not even eat red meat. He had to have it cooked to the point of near burning before he'd even eat it. So there was a doctor in Georgetown who had just built a home. And this doctor had had a large stone cut down in the creek that he wanted to have for his porch. He tried to get all the teamsters and any team that could in town to bring this heavy stone up to his house. He was willing to pay them $100 to whoever could do it. There was a team of 5 men who could not get this big slab rock up to the doctor's house. Ulysses was a young teenager, and he said, "I can do it all by myself." Now, where I hated math, I did not like numbers at all. Ulysses excelled at it. In fact, he wanted to be a mathematics professor when he grew up, instead of going in the tannery business. He took this wagon down to the creek, and he figured it out how to do a trench and get that slab of rock up underneath that wagon. He took it up to the doctor's house, and he laid it down in the same fashion. That rock stood up there for a long time. It was estimated to weigh over 2,000 pounds. But he was a determined young man. You didn't quit till the job was done. That would serve him quite well later in life, I think. So when we met, like I said, we were just friends for a couple of months when he first asked me to marry him. He knew he was going to be shipped out to Louisiana because of the American-Mexican War that was getting started down there. He was on leave. He went home to see his folks in Ohio. And when he came back, of course, he asked me again if I would marry him. We were on our way to a wedding, and he had been invited as well, and he was escorting me to the wedding. And we were getting ready to cross over a bridge, and it had rained quite a bit, so the water was almost touching the bottom of the bridge, and I was very scared. I kept wanting to tell him to go back around. We could find a different way. No, he was determined we were going to make it across that bridge. So I told him that if we fall in, I was holding on to him for dear life, and there was nothing he could do about it. He said, okay. Got to the other side of the bridge, and he used that against me. He said, you can hold on to me for the rest of your life, and I won't do anything else about it. So we kind of secretly became engaged at that point. I exchanged a lock of my hair for his West Point ring, but I told him we couldn't tell Papa. Oh, we didn't want to tell the colonel right away. You know, my daddy didn't think that military life would suit me. He thought a military pay would not support Miss Julia. He wanted to pair him off with one of my younger sisters. He didn't mind that, but not me. So I told Ulysses we could not do that, and Ulysses, of course, was too shy at that point to even ask for my hand himself. So it was not until he got down to his new post in Louisiana that he decided that he would write to my father. And of course, Father, he never answered the letter. It was about a year or so later that Ulysses came home on leave. Papa was getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. on a business trip. And we were all telling him goodbye on the front porch. He was in a rush to leave when Ulysses arrived. So it was then that Ulysses asked for my hand, and so he could leave in a hurry. He said yes. He also thought a young man going off to war just might not come back. I know how my father thought. But he did. And we were married 3 years later, in August of '44. And so it was after that marriage that I followed him to his different posts. We were in New York, we were in Detroit. You think winter's cold here? Live up there in a cabin. That was not the best time of my life, but I did learn to become a little domestic. I tried my best to make a nice home for us up there. I enjoyed the company of the other officers' wives. We did pretty well there. I had our first son when Ulysses was away, and we named him Frederick, after my father, after my brother. And Ulysses was going to be shipped out west. Now, he was not going to be taking the direct route. He was going to be taking some other family members of the officers around, and they were going to go through Panama to get to the West Coast. Now, I was expecting our second child. I was too far gone to be traveling that way. I was going to try to maybe meet him later after that. But instead, I went back to Ohio to stay with his parents for the birth of our second son. Our second son we named Ulysses Jr., but we called him Buck for short because he was born in Ohio and he was a Buckeye. So Buck was his nickname. Now, speaking of names, you know, as I told you, my husband's name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And when he was appointed to West Point, when he arrived, he signed in as Ulysses Hiram Grant because he did not want the initials of Hug to be the first thing that the other boys saw. And they told him, they said, well, you were registered as Ulysses Simpson Grant. A congressman that knew my father had nominated him to go to West Point, but he knew that he was called Ulysses, and his mother's name was Hannah Simpson Grant. So he assumed that him being the oldest son, that he had his mother's maiden name as his middle name. So he was registered as Ulysses Simpson Grant. Now, when he signed in on the wrong name, they said, it cannot be changed. If you want to go to West Point, you either change your name or you don't go. That's when he became U.S. Grant. And of course, there was another Ohio boy there that was a year older than him, William Tecumseh Sherman. He had an original, unusual name too. And as soon as he saw that, he said, U.S. Grant, United States Grant, I'm calling you Sam. So Sam was his nickname in the military. Much better than Hug. So he didn't mind that much. But when he was being deployed out west, and I couldn't go, and I had our other son, he caught malaria when he was going through Panama. And when he got to the West Coast, he was not doing well. He missed us. He had not seen our second son yet. And he was very lonely. We had not really been separated for that length of time after we were married, just before. And so Ulysses, what a lot of people didn't know, he had extreme migraine headaches. And he would drink a little alcohol sometimes, which he could not tolerate well. So what they always thought sometimes as him being extremely drunk was a combination of a little alcohol with a migraine headache. So he did get a bad reputation, and those who did not like him so much exploited that. But he decided, after he'd been out there a while, that military life was not really what he wanted. He wanted to come home. He actually wanted to be a farmer after we got married and had children instead of a professor, because he wanted to raise horses. He was very good at that, remember. So he resigned his commission. He came home, and we had our first daughter. He insisted that I name her Julia. But by the time she was 18 months old, we rechristened her as Ellen, because my mother was sick and she was not doing well, and she passed away. So I named her in honor of my mother. Now, it was this time that Papa had given Ulysses some land. It was adjacent to Whitehaven. Ulysses wanted to build a home, and I was thinking in my mind that we finally would have a nice home like my brothers had, that was a nice paneled home, or a stone home like Whitehaven was. No, Ulysses wanted to build a log cabin by hand himself. Now, it had 4 rooms, 2 up, 2 down, and a nice hallway in between, but no matter what I did, I could not make that log cabin into a home. I brought out all my nice linens and pillows and everything, but underneath it was still a log cabin. We did not stay there long. We named that place Hard Scrabble. Not only was it hard to scrabble a living out of the land, but it was also hard to decorate and make a home. We didn't stay there long, basically because my mother, after she had passed away, my father just wasn't doing good in that big old house by himself. He still had a few servants, of course, and everything, but it wasn't family. So we moved in with our children and lived with my father at Whitehaven for a while. Now, that's when the crash happened in '57, and it was hard Scrabble everywhere. It was hard to make a living no matter what. Papa couldn't even make a living with his orchards and things that he had, because he had beautiful orchards there on the plantation. They raised fruit, a lot of fruit. And so at this point, Ulysses' parents had moved to Illinois, Galena, Illinois. His father had opened another tannery out there, and his younger brothers were working in the tannery. And it was there that we decided to go, because We just couldn't make a living there in St. Louis, so we moved out to Galena, where Ulysses did not want to work in the tannery, but he worked inside his father's shop because he was very good with books. He was very good with the maths. So he started taking care of his father's business end of that. When, of course, in 1861, that's when everything fell apart. Now, Ulysses, being ex-military, was asked to lead a group of volunteers for Illinois. Now, when he was in the Army before, he was a quartermaster. He was an extremely good quartermaster at the time, and a quartermaster is somebody who provides all the supplies for the troops. And so when he was put in command, he was also asked to be the quartermaster for the volunteers. Now, that's not really something he wanted to do. He wanted to see action. Even when he was in the Mexican War there, he would volunteer for things when it wasn't his duty to do so. If some of the troops needed supplies on the front line, Ulysses was the first one to say that he was going to take the ammunition up front. In fact, one time he even rode side saddle on the horse, using it as a shield, and when he got to the front lines, he had holes through his uniform. He was a little bit of a daredevil, let me tell you. But he liked action. He couldn't sit still. That was one thing about Ulysses. He couldn't sit still. So when the war broke out and everything, I did go back to Whitehaven. I was not really doing well, as so many of my family was on the wrong side of what we were. We weren't really judged, but I know my brothers were in the Confederacy. In fact, I had one of my brothers spend some time in a Confederate prison, and Ulysses did not get him out. So that was not hardship with us. But many, many times during the battles and everything, I would go to the front lines and spend time with Ulysses. And as he gained rank and everything, I sometimes would take the children with me. We were overrun one time, and our oldest son, Frederick, took a bullet in the thigh. He was kind of proud of that, actually. He was the mascot of the troop. He had his own little uniform and everything. He was almost like the drummer boys. But there was one time that we even had to be hidden, that we weren't going to be captured. But as Ulysses rose in rank, and he was noticed by the president because he fought. President Lincoln wanted a commander that would fight. You see, with the Civil War, it was hard. You know, some of the people who stood up at our wedding with us as witnesses, one of them was James Longstreet. He was my cousin. So James Longstreet, as you know, was a Confederate general. So it was tough. Your families were split all to pieces. And I do know that even in the beginning, his parents didn't approve very much of me and my family. In fact, they didn't even come to our wedding because we were slaveholders, and they were very much abolitionists. But they grew to love me. I grow on everybody. Because remember, Miss Julia, what I want, I usually get. And their respect was something that I really wanted. And I loved them too. They were good people. But we did go quite a bit. And when he was made general and commander-in-chief of the entire Army of the Potomac, that is when we moved to Washington, or I moved to Washington for a while. And that was where I kind of shined. You know, I met the president's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. Not a fan. No. Mrs. Lincoln had a way about her of making you feel about this big. She blamed me for having my eye on the White House. I did, but I didn't want her to know that. But no, she was not the most pleasant lady, let me tell you. So towards the end of the war, and after it was over, we were invited to Ford's Theater with them. And I had been shopping that day, and I knew there was somebody following me. And when Ulysses told me that we were supposed to spend the evening with the president and his wife, I kind of begged off on that and said, I really don't want to spend the evening with that lady. So I told him I had a headache and we were going to go and visit our children in New Jersey. And of course, I think if we would have went, there would have been more tragedy than just Lincoln. So after that, we did move back to Illinois for a while. My husband was awarded quite a bit for his victories in the war. We were given a house in honor of that, where we lived for a while. And when they wanted to nominate him for president, I was all about that. He, not so much. But I thought that would be wonderful and that he would make a great president, because he, at the point, was one of the most famous people in the United States. And when he did finally get elected, he looked at me and he said, well, madam, I hope you're satisfied now. I was. I believe that the 8 years that we spent in the White House was some of the happiest times I'd ever had. We had always had stressful times and hard living and moving from place to place to place, that it was so nice to finally be in a grand place where I could use the skills that my mama taught me of being a lady. You know, I even had the Corps of Engineers put some pillars on the front of the White House because I thought it'd make it look more stately. I think it did. I think those last a pretty long time, too. And after years and years of neglect, the White House was pretty run down. It was grand on the outside, but boy, it needed some work on the inside. So I took that challenge. I had new carpet put in. I had them clean from top to bottom. We put new furnishings. I picked out a nice china pattern. Had little yellow flowers on it. It was very pretty. And so we had dinners. Some of our dinners one of them had 29 courses to it. Some of our dinners would last up to 4 hours. I was in my glory entertaining. And on every Tuesday afternoon, I had an open house tea where anyone, as long as they were properly dressed, men had to have on hats and ladies had to be wearing gloves to be admitted. And when the staff asked me, what about colored people? I said, admit everyone. Admit everyone. I didn't question it at the time, and I should have, why there was never any in attendance. Little did I know that the staff was turning them away before they could come in. There was still a lot of prejudice going along. But we had never really, even though I had been raised that way, I still felt the same way as my husband, because my husband was gifted a slave when we got married. And in those hard times when he would have brought a lot of money, Ulysses set him free. That's the kind of man he was. So as we had our time in the White House, our daughter, Nellie, got married there. We had another son, Jesse. We named him after Ulysses' father. And we had 4 children. We had a nice home. Our oldest son, Frederick, went to West Point. He was going to go into the military like his father. And he was stationed out west with Custer in the 5th Cavalry. Just so happens that he was on leave for the birth of his first child when Little Bighorn happened. So it was by providence that he was home. Now, when Ulysses did not want to run for a 3rd term, he did not tell me until it was too late to submit that. I was very disappointed. So it was after that time when President Hayes and Lucy was going to come into the White House that I waited to the very last moment, throwing a nice big luncheon the day they came in so I could still preside as First Lady one more time. I left the White House in tears. It was a nice time. But we went home to Illinois for a short time, and Ulysses said, let's take a nice trip, a long trip around the world. We were gone for 2.5 years around the world, all over, everywhere we went. We were treated like royalty. We met kings and queens and all sorts of important folk. And there was only 2 countries that didn't really want us there, and China was one of them. But all the other ones treated us really well. I do remember when we were in Italy, though. Italy prided themselves on being top with their cavalry and their horsemanship. They had heard that my husband was an excellent horseman. In fact, he was considered the best horseman in America. He had a record at West Point for the highest high jump that wasn't broken for more than 25 years. And so some of the junior officers, when he was going to be asked to go out and review their troops, he was supposed to get on a horse. Well, when my husband was considered a great horseman, he was younger, he was thinner, he didn't eat much when he was in the Army. Some days he would eat nothing but cucumbers and water. He just was not a very big eater. But 8 years in the White House with 4-hour dinners kind of put a little weight on him. And of course, he was a much older gentleman at that time, too. So when we got to Italy and they thought they would play a trick on my husband by getting the tallest, most spirited horse for him to ride, they expected him just to not be able to get up there or fall off once he did. I remember that circus and the pony that couldn't be ridden. My husband put his foot in that stirrup, swung himself up on that horse, reared it up, and took off like a shot. Those young men's jaws kind of hit the floor. But they gained new respect for him then. So that trip was absolutely wonderful. Our children joined us every once in a while. My daughter had married in the White House, but she married an Englishman. So she was living in England for a while. And so it was when we started to go home, we were getting homesick. And I told him, I think it's time to go home. And we did. And we got there. Our son, Buck, he was a lawyer. He was in business with another partner, and they wanted to use the Grant name. And it was invested that we did. We invested money, and so did my son. Little did we know that it was going to be embezzled by their partner. At one point, we had less than $200 in the bank after having so much. And so it was after that that another tragedy hit us. And Ulysses loved fruit and vegetables, and he truly thought that he had a piece of peach pit in his throat. But you know, years ago, when he was in the Army, he was photographed with a cigar butt in his hand. And adoring fans sent him boxes and boxes of cigars. He ended up with more than 10,000 boxes of cigars. He gave them away, but he smoked more than 20 a day. So therefore, that was not a peach pit in his throat. When we found out it was throat cancer and we were destitute, we didn't know what we were going to do. And he had been asked repeatedly to write his memoirs. And he didn't want to do it before then, but he thought, well, If it makes a little money, then he knows he'd be leaving me with something. Mark Twain was an acquaintance of his who said that he would publish the book when he got it done. And he went out and he pre-sold 100,000 copies. It ended up selling more than 500,000 copies, all in all. But Ulysses had a very hard time writing it. We did, since he got sick in the summertime, we did go up to Mount McGregor in New York, and that was cooler up there on the mountain. And our entire family was able to come up to a cabin that was loaned to us up there. And Ulysses wrote nonstop, night and day. When it got too uncomfortable for him to lay down, he had 2 chairs that he put end to end, and he would sit up and write. When it got to where his hands would hurt, he would try to dictate things to our son, and he would write for him. And then when it got to the point where he was having trouble talking, he had to write everything. I didn't tell you earlier that he used to write me a lot of letters when he was in the service. He probably wrote 10 to my 1. I always told him it was hard on my eye. I couldn't write as well, but he was a very good writer. And when he finished the manuscript, it was just a few days before he was gone. Those last 3 days of his life, he couldn't eat or drink. We had opium water that we'd bathe his throat with to ease the pain. In the night, we knew that he was going to pass. All the kids were there and the grandkids. And he passed early the next morning. His final letter to me was on his person, in his nightshirt pocket. It was telling me to take care of the kids and grandkids, that he would be prouder of them if they kept their word and went to church than if they did anything else. I was totally heartbroken. How do you say goodbye to the love of your life? I couldn't even attend his funeral. But his funeral was attended by thousands. He even had Confederate generals carry his casket. He was a well-respected man. But I'll have to go on with my life. But I have vowed to wear black for the rest of my life because I know I will mourn that man for the rest of my life. And I do know that I will travel a little bit too. In fact, I met a lady. I was at a hotel. I met a lady that I thought I'd never meet. Her name was Varna Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, and I took it upon myself to go knock on her door and introduce myself. We became friends after that. In fact, we lived down the street from each other in New York. And we would go to tea and lunch and different things after that. She was a widow too. And she even attended the dedication of my husband's tomb with me. So I do know that I still feel his warmth and his love from beyond. And I think I always will. Thank you. So does anybody have questions about Julia or Ulysses? Yes?
What was the name of her eye condition?
It was called strabiscus or strabiscus, or it's what they call walleye, lazy eye. My granddaughter has that. She's 19 years old, and she said, "Granny, I've got the eyes of a 65-year-old woman." I said, "Well, so do I."
It's called amblyopia.
Well, I looked it up. Hers was called, I've got it somewhere. It's
Lazy eye also.
do you? Well, I know that when she was in the White House, they had doctors who could correct her eye, and she was actually going to have it done. And the morning of the surgery, Ulysses told her that he didn't want her to have it done, that he fell in love with those eyes, and if she had it fixed, they wouldn't be the ones he was in love with. He was a very dedicated man. He did not cuss. He thought vulgarity was a waste of time. He was actually tone deaf. He hated military music. It drove him nuts. And they think that that's possibly why he could write out orders with bombs falling all around him and not be disturbed. He was a very focused man. And he had a horse by the name of Cincinnati, which I didn't mention. That was one of his favorite horses. It was given to him in 1863. It was 17 and a half hands high. This was a beautiful horse, and the horse was with him until it was just too old to be ridden. And then he ended up giving the horse to his friend, which was General Amon, or Admiral Amon. He was, they grew up together in Georgetown, and he had a farm where the horse retired. But a cute little story I'll mention, it's after Ulysses was a president and the general. He went back home to Georgetown for a little bit. He and his friend Amon were together. They were walking down the street, and a little lady came out of the store, and she was carrying groceries, and she looked up at him and she goes, "Here, Liz, you carry my groceries." So even though he'd been a famous man, this little lady knew him from when he was a child, and he carried her groceries. So anybody else? Yes?
Did a lot of his letters survive?
They have. Yeah, a lot of their letters have survived. They've got some letters. I think there was a thing called Letters to Miss Julia. So yeah, he was very romantic. Nowadays they kind of call him the Romeo and Juliet of their time. Yes.
What is it that you have displayed on the table?
The things that I do have a copy of her memoirs that she had. She did try to get them published when she was still alive. She was the first lady to write them. And like John said before, they weren't published until 1975, which was her great-great-granddaughters, I think, saw the publication. But I just got a picture of her. She always posed to the side because she did not like her one bad eye to be seen. And then there is also the History Channel on Grant. So if you haven't seen that one, that's a pretty good one. And then this is just something I got up there in Georgetown at one of the gift shops. It's called That Grant Boy, and it's stories of him when he was a boy and different things, because he was very popular with the girls when he was younger. He always had access to a sled and horses, so he could always take people for rides.
It's a neat place too.
Georgetown is neat. Yeah. Yes.
What did Mrs. Grant feel about the Civil War? How conflicted was she?
Oh, she was totally dedicated to her husband, and she came to believe everything that he did. She did have servants that led up to the Civil War, but they set them all free. Even though her brothers, she didn't even really plead with Ulysses to get her brother out of the Confederate prison. So, yeah, she was turned, I guess you could say. Convinced, yes.
You mentioned that his family were abolitionists. Have you heard anything about the rumors that they were part of the Underground Railroad?
It's possible they could have been, because being in Georgetown there along the Ohio River, Ulysses actually went to the Rankin School that they had there. So that was one of the schools that he attended. And they would have had access to help folks, but I've not really heard definitively that they did. So, All right, well, thank you all very much. I'm pleased to have been here, and I hope you enjoyed Miss Julia.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Folks, don't forget that there is the preview of the American Revolution experience. And don't forget that if you would like to come for the dedication on Friday at 6:30, you're more than welcome. There'll be some more, excuse me, some members of the SAR there with their displays. And as usual, there's a discount at the gift shop if you'd like to get something today for you. And hopefully we'll see you next month.